Welcome. Hi. Welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series. We're so glad you could join us today. My name is David McWhorter. I'm pleased to be moderating for today's webinar. I serve as the co-chair of the SWS Webinar Planning Committee, and I'm a professional wetland scientist and work as a senior ecological data scientist supporting large-scale wetland monitoring programs. We would like to thank our sponsors this year, Davies Mitigation, SWCA Environmental Consultants, RES, and Marystone. We're excited to share today's webinar on the topic that continues to be highly relevant and critically complex for wetland professionals across the United States. Today's lecture and topic is Regulated Wetlands Beyond WoTUS. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Sean McCostrom. Crossum. Sean is a professional wetland scientist, a certified ecologist, and a wildlife biologist. He currently works for Westwood Professional Services and has nearly a decade of experience working in energy development and more than 20 years experience in wetland restoration and conservation. Academically, Sean holds a bachelor's degree in biology, a master's degree in botany, and a PhD in zoology. His professional career includes pollinator research, habitat conservation across the United States. Over the past decade, he has helped energy development companies understand regulatory requirements, avoid regulated wetlands when possible, and obtain appropriate permits when avoidance was not feasible. In addition to his professional work, Sean has published 2 books on habitat creation, authored scientific papers across multiple disciplines, and contributed to more than 51,000 observations in iNaturalist. Sean, happy to have you.
Thanks. It's great to be here. All right. I'll go ahead and share my screen for the presentation that I'll be giving today, which is regulated wetlands beyond the waters of the United States. So just a quick preamble to what we are, or what I'm going to show you today, is diving into some of the regulations that occur across the United States, and then give you some examples that I have personally had to be a part of in handling different land development issues. So first and foremost, we go from regulated wetlands, which are mostly overseen by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers because of the Clean Waters Act. And inside of the Clean Waters Act, Section 404 is where the waters of the United States are defined. Inside of the waters of the United States, there have been a lot of legal arguments about what defines waters of the United States. So depending on administrations, this has consistently changed back and forth to include certain areas and not other areas. In addition to those waters, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers mandates that their wetlands meet 3 criteria, including hydric soils, hydric vegetation, and specific hydrology, for it to be considered a wetland outside of being an ephemeral, intermittent, or perennial stream. There are other federal agencies that are going to be worried about waters as well, but specifically for wetlands, we typically deal with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. However, there's been a lot of confusion, especially when we're working with clients, on what that means. And specifically, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has jurisdiction over waters of the United States, but that triggers sometimes a Section 10, sometimes it doesn't. But a lot of people, for some reason, think that if waters are not jurisdictional or wetlands are not jurisdictional or present on their site, they don't have to abide by any of the other laws. Literally, a client wrote this to us just a month ago saying we didn't have to do any of that, talking about running a state level natural history request or run an IPAC to complete a T&E assessment because the wetlands on site were not regulated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So they told us there was no need to look into bats and bees. And I can assure you 100% that the Endangered Species Act is a standing regulation, and it must always be consulted when there is land development. Similarly, state endangered species acts are standalone, and there is no trigger for them to be kicked in. They are always standing, just like the waters of the United States. So, in addition to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the federal level will typically get involved with wetlands when there are water bodies or wetlands that are either deemed critical habitat or are easily considered habitat for endangered or threatened species that they are regulating. For example, Diamond Y Spring does not count as a WoTUS, water of the United States, but it is in fact protected because it is critical habitat for the Leon Springs pupfish. Other endangered species that typically fall into wetlands jurisdiction for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service include breeding areas for the Houston toad, Sonoran tiger salamander, and then the Cascade cavited salamander is another good example, which is pictured here on the top right. Inside of the IPAC, if you run one of those as a consultation package, you will typically get a response inside of that letter that says wetlands in the National Wetlands Inventory need to be considered. And that is a modeled inventory that then we go out into the field and double check with data to make sure that those wetlands either exist. But in many areas of the United States, the National Wetlands Inventory model just fails, and it either fails to identify actual wetlands or it accidentally identifies areas that aren't wetlands. So we do have to make sure that there's some field verification when we're going out. And just because something is not on the National Wetlands Inventory doesn't mean it's not going to be of concern with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or even the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Just to reiterate that some of the animals that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is concerned about, those aren't necessarily going to meet any of the 3 criteria that are required for the waters of the United States. As long as it holds water, for many cases, it counts as breeding habitat for a protected species. It will be of concern to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, I'm not speaking for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm just speaking in my experience with these animals and with land development and then working with these regulatory bodies. So if you have different experiences, it might simply be that you were working with different species or different biologists. On the state side, wherever you're working in the United States, you're going to be in a state or within a territory. There are going to be state agencies that are also going to be concerned with wetlands. In some states, there are multiple agencies that specifically deal with water quality. And in other states, there are just the DNR, the Fish and Game, the Department of Environmental Quality, or another agency that is going to kind of oversee everything. Typically, the DNR and the Fish and Game species agencies will get involved when there are habitats, much like with the federal Fish and Wildlife Service. They're going to get involved when wetlands are also counting as habitat for something that they are regulating. Many state best management practices or BMPs are going to recommend following X, Y, and Z to avoid further consultation. Inside of a client, we'll get to this in a little bit, inside of a client's mind, quite often when they see a recommendation, they see not required and therefore figure they don't have to do that. And we'll get into why that's not always true. But inside of these best management practices, they will say do not impact wetlands or waterways, which clearly, or which not so clearly, doesn't specifically say jurisdictional of Section 404 of the Clean Waters Act. And that's left out because they aren't concerned about the jurisdictional wetlands specifically. They're actually concerned about all wetlands and waterways. So in few states actually spell that out and say what they mean. So in Minnesota, in their letters, you will see a paragraph that says unavoidable surface water and wetland impacts, permanent and temporary for the impacts from the proposed project are subject to the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, which is a state agency, the DNR, state agency, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, federal, United States Army Corps of Engineers, federal, and local government permitting requirements. So there's potentially going to be 5 or more agencies involved with any kind of review if a wetland is impacted in Minnesota. When we're dealing with land development, there's going to be needs from the developer, and that generally is to get this project done as quickly as possible. And to do that, they generally want to avoid consultation. And there's, with the best management practices, a number of ways that they can avoid consultation if they follow the best management practices by avoiding wetlands and waterways. Sometimes they're still going to need regulatory permits, and then in consulting, we'll apply for those. But even if you're doing a restoration event, you will still have to consult with these agencies if you're dealing with wetlands. And then, in addition to the developer, they will also quite often be dealing with a third or fourth party for investment and have to deal with their investors' tolerance for risk and whether or not there's going to be any what's the word I'm looking for? Delays in development or delays in the construction of the project if they don't follow these recommendations or get the permits that they need. Inside of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and typically in the state agencies, developers, investors will be able to, or the consultants will be able to utilize an interface and get a very broad consultation package. And fairly often that will trigger a deeper review, but quite often they'll simply get a letter saying, follow these BMPs, you're good to go, but follow those BMPs. Those letters are not saying that that's a recommended task that can be ignored. What they're saying is they recommend following those best management practices to avoid further consultation. So when those best management practices are not followed, that means further coordination needs to be done with the state. This is something that I find many clients get hung up on, but also other biologists. So I want to spell that out a few times for you all, because just because something is saying you should do X, Y, and Z, it doesn't mean that they aren't required to do that or something else. And because the word should seems to be negotiable because it is, it's just saying that's one option. The other options are doing other things. It's not saying do this or not do this and you're still good to go. Quite often, however, developers or their investors want additional scrutiny on their project, and they're asking for specific letters from those state agencies or federal agencies saying, we totally agree with what you're doing. We're not going to hold anything up. And in the consulting world, that is very dangerous. If any of you have had the luck of working in Iowa and trying to repower a wind farm since 2025, the overall regulations there changed drastically. And unfortunately, the client that we were working with refused to accept the state level review saying, yes, we accept that you're repowering. You should be good to go. Just make sure you check for bats and things and do your post-construction. I got an email back that's being shown here from the state saying, actually, there's a lot more here that we didn't realize we weren't paying attention to. And then we're asking, why are the models getting bigger? And that's because technology is getting better. What's the function of that? What was this going to do? And then they started working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and now the entire state of Iowa, when there is a repower project, they now have to follow this new thing, which would have probably caught up eventually, but biologists simply weren't paying attention at that moment. So our client was delayed by 9 months and then mandated to do 2 more years of post-construction monitoring as if this was a brand new wind project. So typically getting an agency to really look at your project is not a good idea, and it will generally cause delays. So I want to walk through a few of the examples where a project has moved into or has moved forward trying to get to construction, and we have dealt with permitting issues or constraints within the construction. So out in Texas, we can do what's called a wildlife habitat assessment, and you submit your overall habitat assessment for the T&E species protected under the Texas state, and they will send back a best management practice list. One of the things that they send is in the box on the bottom left, and it will say, when designing a proposed utility scale solar facility, plans should be made to avoid the following: streams, ephemeral, intermittent, and perennial streams. Again, notice the word should is in this, and that is because if they don't avoid this, they need to do further consultation with the state. They should be avoiding wetlands, both jurisdictional and non-jurisdictional. Texas is one of the states that spells that out. They are not talking about U.S. Army Corps of Engineers jurisdiction. They're talking about all wetlands, drainages, springs and seeps, ponds, floodplains, etc. In this project, there are some areas that are vegetated, hold water, actually meet the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers definition of wetlands, and have ephemeral connections to intermittent bodies. So back in 22, these were potentially jurisdictional underneath the waters of the United States. Things have changed. These are no longer considered jurisdictional underneath the waters of the United States, but the state is still saying, hey, you have multiple amphibians out there that probably use that as breeding habitat. This land is really disturbed. That's one of the few areas that's intact. Don't mess with it. And a client we've had to walk them through a few times saying, oh, but the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers said it's not a problem. It's not under their jurisdiction. We've had to continue to explain to them, but we've already agreed with the state that you're not going to impact them because we have these amphibians. And if they want to go ahead and impact these areas, the state is going to require presence absence surveys, which will take about 2 years. That's a huge delay, especially when you have things already moving into the country to start your development. So these wetlands will continue to be avoided from their development. In Minnesota, we had another client, and again, these pictures are just facsimiles. These aren't actually from the projects, that had a man-made stormwater basin like you see here next to an already developed area. They want to develop that stormwater plan or stormwater pond, make it bigger but a different shape, and then build on the north end of it pretty much. We've had to consistently work with both our biologists and the client to explain that these wetlands still have to go through consultation with the 5 agencies. And because the DNR, or the state DNR, called these wetlands out for potentially being habitat for Blanding's turtles, if they impact them, then we have to do surveys for Blanding's turtles. So we're trying to avoid doing any of those surveys because they want to develop, in the next couple of months. So that means that they have to change their construction plan because they didn't heed our warnings in the beginning. This kind of mistake happens a lot because there is also this idea inside of business and inside of consulting that man-made wetlands are not jurisdictional ever, and that is 100% incorrect. And man-made wetlands will quite regularly fall underneath the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers regulation, as well as underneath habitat for endangered organisms or threatened organisms. In New Mexico, one of the situations that we came across was working with the state to actually lease out some of their land for some community solar projects. In one of the areas that we were looking at, there was this massive man-made impoundment next to an ephemeral draw that had a decent-sized floodplain that you can see here in the polygon of green and blue, and then the man-made impoundment is in the blue hash. The client, I did the T&E for this, the threatened and endangered species habitat assessment, worked with the state on these, worked with the client, explained over and over again that these areas have to be avoided. The state is saying they have to be avoided. And because it's state land, they actually have to listen to the agencies. There's a lot more coordination, even though there are best management practices being put forth. With the state listed toads that were in that area, the state was finally like, look, you guys can develop this, but you have to do an 18-month breeding survey only during the monsoon season, and there has to be adequate amounts of rain for that to fill up for it to count. So this isn't even just 18 months delay. This could be potentially 36 to 48 months delay, because if there are really poor monsoon seasons, this wouldn't fill up and they couldn't look for the Sonoran toad. There is some discussions about using some other methods in the future, but currently eDNA and doing environmental DNA swabs, trying to look for these species, is not accepted by any of the states. So hopefully one day that will expedite when we're trying to identify what could be in the area. But for this situation, the area that the client was trying to build on is pretty much the size of the entire photo. And they had to abandon this project after lots of development because they did not want to listen to the state. They didn't want to listen to the biologist or their consultant, and just barreled on through because somebody was whispering in their ear, man-made wetlands are not jurisdictional, ephemeral streams are not jurisdictional. And that's true for this situation when we're talking about the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but it did not in any way, shape, or form take into consideration the threatened and endangered species that could be living there. I think this is the last example I've got for you, but in Illinois, we've had a lot of projects recently get tied up with the Illinois chorus tree frog. The Illinois chorus tree frog is like many other tree frogs. It only needs about 5 gallons of water to breed. And inside of Illinois, you have to get an incidental take authorization permit. They're fairly quick to get. They take about 3 to 6 months to get if you do them quickly. But it leads to spaces like roadside ditches, small ponds, becoming potential for their habitat. So when they're known to occur in an area, the state is being very protective about the species, which is great. And there's a lot of ways to simply work around these wet areas, especially in the agricultural areas. But for the clients and developers that don't want to avoid those spaces and simply see one path forward, it's catching them off guard. So with the Illinois chorus tree frog, we have a running joke in our office that a 5 gallon bucket of water is protected in Illinois, and it's because in some situations it is if there is a strong population of the Illinois chorus tree frog in that space. So with this, I just want to conclude with everybody that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is a fantastic agency and it absolutely has regulations over many of the wetlands inside the United States, but there are a number of wetlands that fall outside of their jurisdiction that still become regulated by other agencies. State agencies do exist that are also concerned specifically with wetlands, and those must always be consulted with if there are any bodies of water on your property or even sometimes wet grasslands. There are different state protected species and state departments that will have consulting requirements. And anytime a species potentially is using a wetland as a habitat, you want to consult with the right authorities on whoever is protecting that species to make sure that there are no restrictions on potential habitats. Lastly, man-made wetlands and stormwater ditches can be regulated and quite regularly are regulated. So we want to make sure that we're double checking with our agencies if we're doing any development or restoration work. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you. That was very informative, thought-provoking. So moving on to Q&A, I'll be posing your questions and possibly a few of my own that have been submitted in the QA box. To everyone, please continue to feel free to submit into the QA box. If you think of leaving early or think of a question afterwards, you may contact the presenter using the email listed on this slide or listed in the admit. Okay, we had a question about man-made wetlands being regulated. The Army Corps specifically exempts stormwater management facilities. Are you saying that Minnesota, this has not been the practice?
Yes, so in Minnesota, the state agencies want to review any of those man-made impoundments. And then the DNR gets involved when there are any potential threatened and endangered species. So larger man-made impoundments, like the one that I was showing you, are potentially inhabited by blanding turtles. Blanding turtles can have over 1.5 mile range from their host wetland that they'll move for breeding, for courtship, and for hibernation. So they really will they can colonize these spaces very quickly, and that's why they're regulated so heavily in Minnesota.
Okay, cool. I got another question. And this has been my understanding that Section 7 consulting only applies to projects with federal permit nexus. If the wetland are non-jurisdictional, what is the route for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife to regulate? Is it through the endangered species or?
Yes. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and again, I don't work for them. This is just in my experience. They will become concerned with wetlands when there are potentially threatened or endangered species that they do have jurisdiction over. So the Houston toad is a good example because they use pocket wetlands for breeding inside of oak savannas. This includes cattle ponds. So in some of our pipeline work, we like literally had the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service say, do not impact that cattle pond, or you guys need to be doing surveys or get an incidental take permit for that species. And those take a long time to get. So when I was doing oil pipeline work, they simply went around and then bored under all the wetlands in those spaces so that they didn't have to be concerned about the Houston toad. But yes, the wetlands that would not be considered wetlands by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in general were still considered regulated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in that situation. So it will happen.
We got a question about a PDF of the presentation. Normally we would just do the YouTube webinar, but if someone emails you for a copy, you're okay just distributing
Yep.
PDF. Okay. Would you recommend different types of stormwater detentions to avoid potential uh, endangered species, threatened and endangered species to occupy it?
That is a loaded question. Um, and I'll actually back up a little bit broader. So I also work a lot with pollinators, monarchs being one of my specialties, and working in solar facilities as they're starting to, or not starting to, as most solar facilities understand that it's important to have their areas vegetated just for soil erosion control. They're finding that milkweeds like to show up in these disturbed habitats, which is where milkweeds like to show up. So we now have this potential for the Endangered Species Act to start regulating mowing events inside of these areas simply because the monarch might exist there. And that'll only happen when the monarch is listed. So we now have clients trying to create vegetation management plans that will exclude milkweed from their sites so that they won't have to worry about that. Now, the other issue with solar farms and overall vegetation is that birds will breed in there anyways, and they need to avoid birds in the breeding season underneath the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which again falls underneath the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So there are some other issues that fall into all of that vegetation management, but it's the same idea of there is land development and then management of those spaces that can create habitat that needs to be planned for. So inside of the spaces where people might be making stormwater management, large ponds or short ponds, ones that are going to drain down faster, like in a 2-day period, those are probably not going to be breeding habitat for amphibians. They just simply won't hold water for long enough unless you have a crazy rain event. So there are ways to plan around it. But is that recommended? That might be a huge cost. Where if once you build a stormwater management pond and it's just clean water that's going in there, if you don't have to do anything to that stormwater management area, then there's really no reason not to create the habitat there. And you could even work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers or the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, get a safe harbors agreement so that once that habitat is created, there's no massive regulation on anything happening with that besides no intentional destruction of it.
Got another question. It's been my understanding that things like the endangered species and historical property review only require if a project has a federal nexus. For example, these are impacted federally jurisdictional wetlands, or a project requires an NDPDS permit. Is this not the case?
Um, so there was parts of that that are the case and parts of that that are not the case. So when there's federal nexus, certain aspects of the archaeological review are required, but there is nothing about a federal nexus that um, stops the Endangered Species Act from being overseen. Endangered Species Act protects animals and species that are protected underneath it, no matter where they occur or for what reason they occur, except for the experimental populations. So um, the Endangered Species Act, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service must always be consulted. It doesn't matter if there's a federal nexus. And then any of the species that they oversee, those need to be handled with the correct amount of respect and due diligence so that they are not impacted or accidental take occurs.
Okay, I have a qualification from Ellen's last story about last question about the Section 7 permit nexus. It says to qualify, how would the Fish and Wildlife Service get notification about a potential habitat concern if there's no direct consultation with them?
So all projects should be going through an IPAC review, which is just an online portal. And then in many cases, there is no oversight. Like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service isn't going to step in and say anything. But unfortunately, there are quite often projects that go in next to lawyers or really smart people or people who have legal in their family that don't want those projects to happen. And they will weaponize the law to the furthest extent possible. When I was working on a project in Virginia, we had a big time lawyer next door didn't want this project to go in any way, shape, or form. And he was out there. He had his staff out there marking where bird nests were, like trying to get them fined for every single thing that they could do. And they were like, which is great because we need that level of regulation kind of kicked in. But the laws can be weaponized. And if you don't do your due diligence as a consultant, you can really leave yourself open for horrible legal problems. So that's why I now lean very heavily on follow the regulations, do what we're supposed to be doing, and then in most cases follow the intent of the law as well as the letter of the law.
That's a good leeway to the next one. It says, do you recommend running an IPAC on every aquatic resource delineations? Are those federally listed species protected on wetlands or private lands?
Yes, so federally endangered species are protected, especially animals are protected no matter where they occur. Plants are still protected, but there's a much easier way to allow take, there is no federal nexus with plants, the landowner can simply say, I give you permission to do this. You have to have it in writing, and then you're legally allowed to take those plants. Typically, if that's going to happen, please reach out to any of your local groups like Lady Bird Johnson, Nature Conservancy, to see if there's anyone who's doing a breeding program for those plants and try and get them adopted into those programs. But the Section 7 does not protect you, or lack of Section 7 does not protect you from harming endangered species. So if, for example, you go out, there's a tree, there's no wetlands, someone decides to cut down that tree and it has northern long-eared bats in it, and it's a roost, you're in a lot of trouble. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service knows where those are. So you don't want to do that. Always make sure you're consulting IPAC and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the state agencies as well.
Okay. Do you clients ever assume presence of endangered species to make permitting go quicker? If
Yes.
so, do you have any examples of times where that be good or bad?
Yes. So a good example is in Illinois. Yeah, Illinois. We had a client just assume presence of Blanding's turtles in the project that they were working on. We applied for an incidental take authorization, paid for the mitigation, which was around $60,000, and just got the permit, got the go ahead from the state, and continued on with the project. So we just assumed that they were there. Quite often, oil pipelines will just assume presence and simply bore under any of those protected habitats and keep on moving forward. So yeah, to answer your question, yes, it is quite often people assume that it's there and then they behave accordingly and avoid those areas.
Yeah, that's related to another question. It says, instead of taking potentially up to 48 months of monitoring, couldn't the client just assume and take and mitigate? So just,
That is going to be up to the state. So that's the other issue. And the species protection levels. So the Houston toad's a good example where if you assume presence, how are you going to assume take if you don't know how many are going to be on the property? So quite often, in my experience, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is not amenable to assuming presence for that one, and they actually want to know population size. So it's not just a presence absence surveys; it's actually a population study as well.
does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have an enforcement arm? Will pull packs on local projects without federal funding nexus and conduct a habitat assessment, but do not follow up afterwards?
Can you read that again? Sorry.
All right. Does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service have an enforcement arm?
Yes.
Do and if and do they follow if they will they follow up later? If sorry to conduct a habitat assessment.
So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does have an enforcement arm. One of the most publicly prevalent examples is the wind farm that was fully shut down because they did not get an eagle take permit and continued to take eagles. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service oversees eagles because of the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Um, Typically, if there are really high quality habitat or really strong populations of whatever they're protecting, they're going to be more um, rigorous about enforcing any of those projects and keeping an eye on any projects to go through in those spaces. The other times they will enforce their fines is when you have neighbors or community members that are consistently pushing them to push charges. When I was out on Catalina Island, a good example is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service fined a tree company because they cut down a palm tree. The landowners told them to cut down the palm tree. It was hosting yellow, what is it? night herrings, yellow-crowned night herrings. Three babies died. You can look this one up on Google. And the tree company was fined $15,000 for killing those babies. So yes, there are fines, there are legal fees, and there are arrests that can happen if you really screw up.
I have a question about the tree and the long-eared bats.
Mhm.
Massachusetts, the northern long-eared bats and the tricolor bats are considered endangered or threatened statewide. Does that mean a consultation should be happening anytime a tree over 3-inch DBH is cut?
Good question. So it's going to depend on your species and it is going to depend on your season. So quite regularly, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will simply put out do not clear trees during the maternity roost season. And then you have the option to clear trees during the winter seasons when they're in hibernaculus. Massachusetts, that's going to be happening. However, out here in Texas, tricolored bats are not roosting in caves year round because it's warm enough in the south. So we have other stipulations out here, but there are ways to work around that. For any area that has bats that are going to be roosting in crevices or potentially in bats or anywhere that's going to be impacted, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service should at a minimum be consulted to see what their windows of activity are permitted for and if permits are needed or if surveys are needed or if a bat biologist needs to be brought on to the project.
Not sure if you might know this. It says, I have a question. Does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service require any special credentials to identify and map endangered species habitat for habitat assessments? Is there a
Good
minimum?
question. That is a
Yeah.
really good question. For habitat delineations, I have not seen any requirements for the biologist doing a habitat delineation. But as soon as a species needs to be handled, a species needs to be surveyed for, or you're doing presence absence surveys, that's when certifications need to happen. Typically, you have to get a permit. Like I'm permitted to handle and look for Dakota skippers, to look for rust patch bumblebees. We have people on our staff that are permitted to handle the golden cheek warbler, all the bats in the U.S. So yes, there are requirements for certain activities, but specifically delineating potential habitat is not um, needed for. There's no permit needed for that.
It's a multi-part one. I'll try to. In multiple agency scenarios, what is preferred the sequencing? Army Corps first, state first, or concurrent? What drives that decision? Then when agencies disagree regarding effect determination, what resolves it most often? Is it additional field data, peer review, site visits, or formal delimitation processes? Do you recommend a single delimitation report for all programs or separate sections, appendices by agencies, and why? And it's a long one. We can take it piece by
It is
piece.
a long one, but also still a good question.
Yes.
So we typically start on the federal level, but with the current administration and changes in the federal agencies, states are starting to step up. Certain states like Ohio, Wisconsin, we tend to work with them concurrently when working with the federal agencies when there are overlaps in their jurisdictions. Um, for wetlands, if you have a wetlands biologist going out and mapping all wetlands on site, not just the ones that meet the criteria of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer, then that report is solid. It should be solid enough to submit to the other state agencies. Quite often, I will see state agencies look at a report that we submit to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer, and they will say, this is insufficient. There's only intermittent streams. There's only certain things. And they're looking up at some of the mesic grasslands and ephemeral streams that they have concern over. So they will ask for a second site visit and more data collection for those. I have personally never seen a peer review negate a agency's opinion, including the time where the agency continuously told me that I was wrong when I was citing 10 papers from other researchers saying that I was right. So peer review is not necessarily the right or the method that will allow a change in opinion, but working with the agencies. If you have to work with both state and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer, our go-to is to ask the state what they would prefer. Do they want to be worked with concurrently, or do they want to rely on the decisions of the federal government first and then make their decisions in the second as a backseat? Did that answer all those points?
Thanks. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. So
Very,
here's
very
one.
good question.
Here's one. Uh, in my experience in New York, the Fish and Wildlife Service typically only consults directly with other federal agencies for Section 7 consultation. We often submit projects to IPAC to generate species lists for environmental review, but there's no federal nexus. How would we go about consultation? How would that only need to be initiated if we suspect an incident may occur to a reported species?
Yeah, so great question. And the then part of that was the answer to your question. Yes. So if there is any habitat that is likely going to be occupied by the species of concern, that's when you would push the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for further consultation, and they're supposed to legally required to respond to those inquiries because they are responsible for those species that are potentially occurring in that area. How they decide to handle that is up to them. Again, I don't work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I don't work for any of the state agencies, so I can't actually speak for them. But in my experience, and I did work in New York, worked in Westchester for a while, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service came out when we had potentially good habitat for a few things that they were concerned about, and they were really excited to work with us to see if we had bats on our properties. So, yeah, they'll come out. You just have to email them.
Nice. Not sure if you want to field a WoTUS question, but
We can try.
yeah, in November, WoTUS definition update is still a draft. What key changes are to the wetland conditions subject to the Army Corps regulations are under update? And that is also there's a second question that's real close to us. Is what proposed rule change have been approved by the EPA under WoTUS? And so basically, what are they? What rules are actually under review in this new draft?
So that I don't know. I've kind of stepped away from our wetlands delineation aspects and focused more on wildlife. And at the firm that I work with, we have a strong team of wetland biologists. So I just go out and delineate things, and then they handle the AJDs and the nationwide permits. So you will have to follow up with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer on that one.
Oh, here's one. You mentioned that none of the states accept eDNA results as proof of presence or proof of presence absence. Does federal accept eDNA results? And are the states warming to eDNA or may start using the method anytime soon?
So I haven't seen because we've proposed it a few times on like going to the wetlands and sampling it and running some eDNA. Um, and the states have been like, nope, we don't accept that. It's not an approved policy. I have not heard any conversation or inklings that any of the state agencies are excited about doing that. Um, but that doesn't mean those conversations aren't happening. If anyone knows of those happening, that's great. But at the moment, I don't know of any agencies that have sought to find procedures and protocols that they would find acceptable that include eDNA.
Uh, with there being some shakeups about WOTUS happening with with regularity now. Should the SWS as a professional group look at drafting a policy paper to inform action at the state level?
I would support that. Yes. I, that's just my professional opinion. It doesn't mean you have to do it, but there are a number of states that are changing their roles in the way that consultations have been happening. A number of the states that we work with that have typically in the past, like before 2022, they would consistently say, we will rely on whatever the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says, we'll rely on whatever the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers says, are no longer saying that, and they are developing their own protocols and procedures to make sure that their resources are protected to the level that they want them to be protected. So yes, I would recommend that professional societies step up and help explain what's going on our end and hopefully inform some of their decisions because quite often the state agencies don't know what we have to go through to do the work that we do.
There's a comment says Ohio appears to be using eDNA a bit more for hellbenders. That's good.
Fantastic. We got
Yeah.
one. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. In your professional experience, which state has been the strictest state level regulations you've encountered? Is it the 5 gallons in Illinois, or is someone more strict?
Yeah. Honestly, no state stands out in my mind as being the strictest as as an overall. Um, And that's because I've had to work with so many of these states with multiple different species. So there are specific species that become more and more regulated. But for wetlands as non-habitat, I would say Oregon was the largest headache because that involved multiple site visits at certain times of the year for the state to be comfortable with our assessment of wetlands.
Okay. Have you taken any training or read any material that greatly helped you understand wetlands and waters permitting? If so, could you share those resources? Do you have any recommendations of materials for newer biologists understanding regulations across agencies better?
So unfortunately, there was no training that I was able to go to that I learned all this. I had to learn all of this on the job, and from mistakes of clients, from my own mistakes. And I was lucky enough that my first job in consulting was at a very small firm where I operated as our GIS person, our wetlands person, our wildlife person, did all of the permits. The other biologists that I worked with did the same thing. So now I work in a very large professional area where I'm working with a team of people, many of them new from college, and they're learning very specific laws and regulations, and they get to do a deep dive. But they're also having not problems, but we're coming into circumstances where they don't understand the overlap with other agencies until we start meeting with that department and realize that there is overlap. But a
Nice.
good just rule of thumb is check your IPAC, check your state level agencies, and check U.S. Army Corps of Engineer. And those three agencies will typically cover you for the inside of the United States. When you start working on the coast, there are other groups that you have to work with as well.
Okay. Scrolling. Lots of questions. I'm just making sure I didn't forget anybody's. Of course, if I did miss your question, you can feel free to email Sean. And we now that the questions have slowed down, now we have a series of thank yous. So thank you very much for taking your time today. Let's see. Oh, as I was closing questions, uh, one question. I'm a little confused on how the Fish and Wildlife Service define a wetland that's not a wetland as per 404. I work in Chapter 105 under the DPE, sorry, DEP. Um, would I would think that they could call an area habitat for a species, but not a regulated wetland. So
So, yes to both of those. They could
not
call an area habitat, and therefore they regulate that habitat. And they're going to draw the boundary around that habitat by saying it's a wetland because of either the plants that grow there or the hydrology. Doesn't need to necessarily have all three criteria like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer.
okay. Also worth mentioning for this audience, none of the WoTUS wetlands can still be regulated. It can still be regulated wetland. In this case, Washington, those cases are not much point seeking Army Corps jurisdiction for wetlands, waiting through the process since wetlands can be regulated by the state, not to mention uh, ESA and NPH Section 4,
Yep.
Section 106, and state cultural resources. Yes, all true.
Yes. So there's a lot of overlap. Again, as the end point of that is that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is only one agency that regulates wetlands, and there are many different agencies that have the potential to regulate wetlands, and there's going to be a lot of overlap. Some states there are even wetland agencies, so you have to report to them, like in Minnesota.
Yeah, I remember uh, like the water districts in Florida are an interesting beast as well. They're like
Yeah, I want to work in
intermediate.
Florida. I've never had the chance, unfortunately.
Yeah. We got a question. We have a comment from Jason. It's like Tennessee regulates isolated wetlands.
Yeah,
Nice.
Connecticut does too.
Nice.
That was very interesting to realize, but it's good. I'm glad. I'm glad these areas are protected. We need our wetlands. They do, hydrate us and the earth, and they're a critical habitat for a lot of organisms.
Yeah, I just moved to Rhode Island and know nothing about state regulations currently. But luckily, I'm just doing databases. All right. Oh, Colorado does what? Isolated. Nice.
hmm New Mexico does as well. Uh, there's a lot. There are a lot. So again, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, it's not going to call those their jurisdiction, but you still, as a developer, have to get the permits or avoid them.
Thank you. Okay. If you have any more questions, oh, Virginia does too. Oregon. Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. I would like to close and say we are proud to recognize our 2026 SWS webinar series sponsors, Davy Mitigation, SWCA, Environmental Consultants, RES, and Merystem. You can find our information on our website listed here. Please visit, like, and follow our SWS wetland sponsors. Okay. And don't forget to register for our upcoming webinars at sws.org, and please sure to complete the survey that will be sent to you after today's webinar to receive your certificate of participation, and provide feedback to the webinar series and get your CE. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone that came out.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.